Jumping a car battery can result in damaging your vehicle if done incorrectly, and in some cases can result in explosion. So in this video, not only are we going to go over all of the important details on properly using jumper cables, but we'll also cover proper maintenance, prevention, diagnostic problems, and potential dangers. And at the end of this video, we'll also cover one tool that will make sure you're never left stranded from a low battery. Now, if you're left stranded and your vehicle doesn't turn on, the first step is to do some quick checks to eliminate other possibilities that may not necessarily be a low battery. First of all, make sure your connections are properly tight. Even a little loose can negatively affect the starting capacity of your vehicle. Corrosion can also affect the connections and significantly reduce the starting capacity of your vehicle. So make sure your terminals are tight, and if heavily corroded or grimy, use a wire brush or terminal cleaner to get the best connection possible. Also, a quick note is to be careful with any metal tools. Bridging the positive terminal to any bare metal or other terminal will result in heavy sparking, and although rare, this could potentially result in explosion. A battery exploding can result in acid in your eyes, and overall a bad day. In fact, one of my best friends got some battery acid in his eyes when he was young, and his eyes are permanently scarred. Fortunately, he still has his vision. Okay, moving on. Before jumping your battery, just do a rapid inspection of the battery and check that the battery isn't damaged or somehow leaking acid. Attempting to start a damaged battery can be dangerous. And now that you're ready, start by selecting a donor vehicle. Starting a larger vehicle with a smaller car is not ideal and will strain the battery of the smaller car. Now, straining the battery won't necessarily damage it on the spot, but it will potentially reduce the lifespan of the battery. Select a donor vehicle that's engine size is equal or larger to the engine of the dead vehicle. The next step is to have proper jumper cables. Not all cables are made equal, and I learned this the hard way. When I was young and had my first car, I got the cheapest jumper cables I could find. And I'm not sure, but I believe they were around 12 gauge wire. I'm not sure how I got such crappy wires in the first place. These wires were so crappy that little did I know they were too thin to start my vehicle at all. Instead, when my first car got a broken cell in the battery, I was completely unable to start the car and the jumper cables got burning hot. At the end of the day, these jumper cables were useless in starting my car, meaning that I just carried these wires around for a couple of years for no reason at all. So generally speaking, I wouldn't buy anything less than 6 gauge wire. 8 gauge and 10 gauge wires are suitable for really small cars or motorcycles. So I would generally consider 6 gauge good for your standard 4-cylinder smaller car, 4 gauge good for a 6-cylinder larger vehicle, and 1 gauge for your larger vans, diesel engines, or other larger vehicles. Though if you get all the way up to semi-trucks, for example, these vehicles require very thick specialized wires. A special thanks to HyperTough for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now, I got my HyperTough collection started with the cutoff tool, the 1/2-inch impact driver, and the power inverter and light, and I have been thoroughly impressed. Since having these tools, I find myself reaching for them more and more, and being impressed at how well these tools work. They get the job done at an unbeatable price. And I find myself setting up this light at every late night project and even taking advantage of the power inverter when I'm working out in the field. The impact driver has been great for working on cars, and I've also used it quite a bit on my shipping container. Additionally, the small cutoff tool has been amazing and far more useful than I expected. I've used it for a lot of things, including making intricate cuts in drywall, for cutting beadboard, for cutting small nails, wire mesh, and so much more. I've really put these tools to the test in my day-to-day work, and they have over-delivered. I genuinely enjoy working with these tools, and they've been an invaluable addition to my arsenal of tools. So if you want to purchase any of these tools, there's links down below. And again, a special thanks to HyperTough for sponsoring this video. The next step is to take a quick look at where the batteries are on each vehicle. Some vehicles will have the batteries under covers, and some will even have the batteries in the trunk. Although vehicles with batteries in the back will often have an access positive terminal in the front, which works just as well for jumping. Now, based on the position of the batteries, determine the best vehicle position to comfortably reach the batteries and still have enough room to get around. Again, keep in mind the positive terminal should never come in contact to the negative terminal or any bare metal. This includes through the wires themselves. So start off by leaving your loose end in a safe position where they won't touch. You'll want to follow a certain procedure to prevent any shorts or mishaps with the connections. So start with the dead battery and only connect the positive wire indicated by a plus and the red wire. Oftentimes, the red wire will have a red cap, though don't rely on this, as I've often seen a red cap placed on the wrong terminal. To be certain, look at the markings on the battery itself, and it should have a plus or minus sign. Now leave the negative terminal in a safe place that's not contacting any metal and move to the donor vehicle. Next, on the donor vehicle, connect both the positive and negative. It's always best practice to start with the positive terminal, ensuring it becomes more of a habit. Now move back to the dead vehicle and connect the negative clamp to bare metal on the dead vehicle's body at least 1 foot away from the battery. Now the negative terminal on all vehicles is connected to the body and chassis. So by placing the clamp on bare metal, it's essentially the same thing as placing it on the battery post. But there's an important reason we don't use the battery post, instead we use the body. This is because connecting the final wire will generally result in some sparks, which can range from minimal to very large. These sparks are particularly important to keep away from your battery. This is because batteries decay over time, releasing hydrogen gas, which is explosive. And while this is rare, you don't want to risk igniting a battery, causing a large disaster. Also keep in mind not to connect to any moving parts or near other flammables like fuel lines. Once all 4 clamps are connected, start up the donor car and let the car run for a couple of minutes. Most user manuals will state to wait around 5 minutes. In this time, the dead battery will begin to charge back up to start the vehicle. Slightly revving the engine of the donor car will also help a bit, increasing the power output of the alternator. After a couple of minutes, give the dead car a try and it should start right up just like that. Now if the dead vehicle doesn't start, we'll cover that a little later in the video. But let's say your vehicle does start. Then remove the clamps in the exact reverse order they were attached and do not turn off either vehicle. The car with the dead battery should run for at least 30 minutes to allow the alternator to charge, and the donor car should run for about 5 to 10 minutes. Now before moving forward, I do have one misconception to clarify here. According to many online blogs and Scotty Kilmer, having the donor car running while starting the dead vehicle is bad and could damage the electronics.
Never have them both running at the same time.
This, however, is not the case. The manual to my FJ Cruiser, the GMC Denali, and the Nissan Altima all state to leave the donor car running. I've also reviewed manuals for Ford, Lincoln, Ram, and Honda, all of which state to leave both cars running. So unless your specific manual states otherwise, it's best practice to leave both cars running. Okay, moving on, let's say your car doesn't start, which is a very common and real possibility. This could be for a number of reasons. The most common is that the battery wasn't given enough time to charge. So, especially if you're jumping a larger vehicle with a smaller one, or you're in extreme temperatures, give the battery some extra time to charge up. The second reason this may not work is that your wires are too thin. Wires that are too thin will not pass enough current and will begin to lose a lot of power through heat. If the wires are getting very hot, chances are they're not thick enough. And the third reason a car may not crank is a broken cell in the battery, which has happened to me before. Most automotive batteries have cells inside in 6 sections. Each of these sections is responsible for providing around 1.9 to 2.2 volts. If, let's say, one of these cells were to break, then you'd only get 10 to 10.5 volts of the required 12. In this case, you need a new battery for sure. However, with proper wires and revving the engine of the donor car, you can often get the car running in an emergency, even with a bad cell. But as soon as you turn off this vehicle, it will not turn back on. A battery with a damaged cell will never work again. It's also not recommended to repeatedly attempt to start a car that won't turn on. Doing this risks the electronic components of your vehicle. This is because the starter will pull voltage from other components and drain the power of other components in your vehicle, putting the electronic components at risk of damage. If you suspect the battery might be damaged, you can get a battery tester or go to your local auto parts to get the battery tested for free and replaced if necessary. If you have a multimeter, you can check the voltage to rule out a bad cell. You can also purchase a cheap load tester, which will tell you a rough estimate of the life of the battery or if it should be replaced, though these cheap testers are not as reliable as the ones you might find at your local parts service. Now, in some cases, the battery is fine, but the alternator isn't charging the battery. So if the battery doesn't show any negative signs, it may be worth looking at the alternator. A quick way to check if the alternator is doing its job is to get a multimeter and test the voltage while the car is running. The battery should go from around 12.6 volts when off to around 14.7 volts when the car is running. Now let's say the battery is good and the alternator is working. The only other common culprits are a bad starter motor or parasitic draw on the electrical system. A parasitic draw is characterized by a battery draining over a short period due to components in the car that may not be turning off as they should. This is equal to forgetting your lights on overnight and the car not starting in the morning. This can often happen with aftermarket mods or accessories in the vehicle. To test for a parasitic draw, you'll need a meter that can test milliamps. An alligator clip here will also help if you don't want the battery to be disconnected. Disconnecting the battery will reset any saved settings such as time, radio, memory seats, and so on. So I'm going to show you how to check for power draw without losing the settings. First of all, loosen the positive terminal on the battery. Then set your meter to milliamps. Then clamp your black wire to the positive terminal clamp. Then with the red wire, hold it firmly on the terminal in the center and simply lift the terminal clamp off the post. This way the vehicle will not lose power as it's still getting voltage through the multimeter, as long as you don't lose contact with the battery. Now check the value on your multimeter. Newer cars will generally have larger draws than older vehicles, but generally speaking you want to see below 80 milliamps and ideally below 50 milliamps. If this is a modern vehicle with a keyless entry, make sure the key is far away from the vehicle so as not to activate any proximity functions on the vehicle that may falsely indicate a high parasitic draw. Now, if none of that is the issue, you may want to look at the starter motor. The starter motor can begin to fail over time for multiple reasons. A bad starter motor can sometimes give the impression of a low battery. A bad starter is usually characterized by no response when turning the key or only a faint click, but sometimes after a couple of tries, it may work and start, leading you to believe the starter is not the issue. Oftentimes, you can get an idea of whether it's the starter or not by getting a friend to whack the starter with a small hammer or heavy tool while you try to start the vehicle. If the problem goes away or significantly reduces, there's a possibility you have a bad starter. Fuses and relays can also become an issue, which you can learn about in this video. Now, there is a lot more to be said about testing alternators, power draws, starter motors, fuses, and a lot more, but that is a topic for another video. It's also important to know how to prevent batteries from going bad. Now, all batteries over time will reach the end of their useful life, but we can extend the life of the batteries. The main enemies of car batteries are physical damage, corrosion, and lead sulfate crystals. To prevent physical damage, all vehicles have a tie-down system for the battery. So make sure the battery is properly tied down and attached to the vehicle. In my Nissan, for example, the tie-down isn't properly sitting on the battery, allowing for movement and likely increasing damage while going over potholes, turns, and bumps. Next, preventing corrosion is a bit more difficult, but you can take steps, including using some battery felt pads that prevent corrosion by neutralizing any acid that may get out. Of course, corrosion will still form on the inside, but allowing corrosion to go unchecked on the outside can accelerate the decay of the battery. So just keep in mind to keep the battery clean and free of corrosion as much as possible. Then you have lead sulfate crystals. Lead sulfate crystals will always form on the inside of a battery, and it's the main reason for reduced battery capacity. However, extreme temperature changes and allowing your battery to run low significantly increase the formation of lead sulfate crystals. So, to prevent this, try to keep your vehicle out of extreme temperatures when possible, and the more common issue, don't let the batteries run low on power. The most common reason for batteries running low is letting cars sit for too long without using them. So, if you have an extra car that's not used as often, leaving it for 1 to 2 months will allow the battery to drain. Now, to prevent this from happening, you either have to make sure to start the vehicle every week or so to allow the alternator to recharge the battery, or you can use a battery maintainer. These devices connect directly to mains power and output a small amount of watts to the battery to ensure it doesn't drain over time, allowing the battery to sit for extended periods of time without damage. Now let's say you want to safeguard against ever being stranded by a low battery. A good quality portable jump starter is a must-have. This particular starter can start my truck without a battery at all. So, as long as I have this charged with me, I'm sure that I will never be left stranded with a low battery. Also, a quick note, today electric vehicles are becoming more common, and most have a 12-volt battery for accessory functions. However, unless the manufacturer states otherwise, do not attempt to start a regular vehicle with an EV. Most EV manufacturers state that trying to start a regular vehicle with this battery will put the electronics at risk of damage. The jumper points on EVs are only for jumping the electric vehicle, not for the electric vehicle to jump other cars. If you're interested in buying any of the tools shown, there's links in the description below that support the channel and help us continue to make this content at no extra cost to you.